For everyone here, welcome. Glad to see you guys. For those of you online, thank you for joining us. This is our June chapter meeting. We have a couple of least items to do before we begin with our presenter tonight. We want to go ahead. We do have a couple of milestones. So John Romero is out manning the voting booth. Hopefully everybody voted today. And then Sherry is, how dare she? She's on vacation somewhere in Paris or somewhere. I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. She's having a hard time, I'm sure. But we do have one certificate to present, and I'll pass it over to Joni.
Do I need to stand somewhere particular?
Yes, if you sit right there, they can see.
Oh, okay. I gotta sit. Okay. We have one of our 2022 graduates who has certified, Dan Martin. We have your certificate, your pins. We owe you an official name tag. They're a little bit behind at the Trophy Plus, but we'll get that to you as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You
Appreciate
bet.
it.
You
Thank
bet. Thank you.
All right, I do want to go ahead and pass it over to our presenter for tonight. Many of you who are birders in any shape or form know who Bill Clark is. Over 50 years of experience dealing with raptors, lecturer, author, you name it, he's done it. And some of you have had the privilege of actually helping with him and some of his banding efforts, which is, I think, a really unique and opportunity. And it's certainly unique for us to have him speak with us tonight. So we'll pass it over to Bill.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. I think I'll just stand here and tell you a little bit about raptor banding in the lower Rio Grande Valley. And there is something here that shouldn't be. How do I get rid of this? There. Okay. And by the lower Rio Grande Valley, I mean Cameron, Hidalgo, and Willacy counties in South Texas. And of course, what we're doing is catching raptors and putting bands on their legs. The first band that every bird gets is from the USGS, US Geological Service, through the bird banding lab. And every band has a unique number, different from every other band. So once we catch a bird and put that band on, it's like a social security number. That's a unique band for that bird. Now, I'm also, for several other species, putting color bands on that can be seen from a distance with just a short code on them. So they have the color and then the code. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I've been banding here since 2003. I live in Harlingen. I live a couple of blocks over that way. And it took a while to get my Texas permit. But once I did, I started banding. And since that time, I've banded 16 different species of diurnal raptor and a total of 4,419. Actually, I've banded a few since I prepared this. And some were banded in the recent years by a sub-permittee of mine for the last 3 years, Mike Stewart. And I'll talk about him in a little bit later. The first raptor I caught down here was a Harris's hawk. And since then, I've banded 1,300 more. It is the most common bird down here. But something's happening in the last 2 years because we are not seeing nearly as many Harris's hawks as we have been before. They're still there. There's still quite a few of them, but I think the numbers are down. We have found a few nests just lately. How do you capture them? Well, almost all the raptors were captured with a Balchatri trap. And so here's the trap. Those of you who are virtual can see it on there. I'm showing it to everybody else where I actually have a trap in here. And inside here are a couple of bands. So after I finish talking, I'll leave this up here if you want to come and look at it. But the thing that works about this is you put something like a mouse inside here, and it runs around, and the raptor is sitting up there and tries to get it. And when he does, he runs his foot across the top, and there's a bunch of monofilament nooses so that it catches them on the toe or around the leg. And then there's weights in here, and then he struggles to get away, and then we run up real quickly, drive up real quickly, and grab the bird. Here you can see the nooses against a solid background. So this red-shouldered hawk, adult red-shouldered hawk, tried to get the lures that were inside there. We call them lures, we don't call them bait because they don't get eaten. And got its foot snagged, and then it went over. And of course, when I came up there, it turned over because it wants to try to foot me. So very carefully, we take them off the trap. Now, a few years ago, in 2012, I wrote an article for Texas Birds Annual on my raptor banding at the time. And one of the pictures I showed there was kind of interesting. This is an adult red-tailed hawk. And what the bird had done was it tried so hard to get to the lures that it got its talons, the meaty part, the one from the back and one from the front, through the mesh of the trap, and it got stuck in there. So it wasn't on a noose. So when I tried to take it off the trap, I had to get pliers and pry it, the foot back off. Another time, oh, there you can actually see it a little bit closer. What was that? It's how it was caught, but not by a noose. Another time, we were trying to catch a juvenile red-tailed hawk, and Gus, who was one of my helpers at the time, and I were watching it, and the bird came down, but he didn't get on the trap, and he just spread his wings like this, and then we figured out why, because two dogs were coming from the other direction, and so he's like this, and the dogs were like this and barking at him, and we were down there, so they drove up real quick because they didn't want the dogs to attack the hawk, and the hawk didn't pay attention to us. So he drove up right behind him, Gus jumps out of the car, he runs up and jumps on the top of the hawk, who's still facing the dogs, and we caught it that way. So the hawks are carefully taken off the trap, and you have to remember, usually they get caught by one foot, so the other foot's there. And you've got to be able to make sure it doesn't grab you. And of course, people like Chuck, who's back here, has helped me a lot, knows that sometimes you don't get it quite right and the hawk gets you. And it hurts. And then once we get it off the trap, we put it into a different tube, and there are different sized tubes for different birds, and it keeps them nice and calm. There are holes so they can breathe, and we can do some processing with them there. Actually put the band on the leg, take some measurements. So I take a bunch of measurements, and I've decided early on that I would take a bunch of measurements on every raptor I caught. If I'm going to catch it, I'm going to take measurements. So I measure the beak from the cere, that's that fleshy part above the beak, to the tip of the beak. And then we take a weight. We take the weight of the bird in the can and then subtract the can. And I take the length of the wing from the bend of the wing to the tip of the wing. And then I take a measure of the hind claw. This is a special measure for raptors because the hind claw is the one that really gives the kill when they catch something. It's called the culmen. And we measure the tail. Now, here's some interesting facts about raptors. One of them is sometimes we catch them and they have a full crop. The crop is an opening in the esophagus where the food, once they eat it, the prey, once they eat it, stays for a half an hour, 45 minutes, and it gets pre-digested by the saliva of the bird. And so, but it's not in the stomach. And so all three of these birds came into a trap because the stomach was saying, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. And the stomach doesn't know that there's a bunch of food up here in the crop. But as soon as that goes down in the crop, then the bird's not quite so hungry. So sometimes we put the traps out and the birds don't respond. They just sit there and look because they're not hungry or they just don't want to have that for that day. So with Harris's hawks early on, I caught multiple hawks on the same trap, often at the same place and often on the same trap. Now here we have a picture of 3 of them on the same trap. Lots of times I caught 2 in the same trap, and one time I caught 4 Harris's hawks together on the same trap. And when we got them off, they all turned to be adults. Okay, what's going on? Well, we know Harris's hawks are cooperative breeders, that they breed in groups of 3 and sometimes 4 adults. But there were some graduate studies done in Texas that involved Harris's hawks. And these graduate studies didn't look at group size. Well, one of them did actually look at group size. They look at difference in hunting between group size. But what these studies didn't do was to actually determine group size in Harris's hawks in Texas. And every one of them thought that most of the Texas Harris's hawks bred as pairs, whereas New Mexico and Arizona Harris's hawks bred in groups. But I knew that wasn't right because I've caught too many. So Texas Harris hawks nest as pairs. So I did a study myself on group sizes of Harris's hawks in South Texas, Southern Texas. And I knew from banding where there were pairs or where there were trios. And so I set up, or more. So it was either 2 or 4, 3, or maybe 4 or 5. And so this is the call of a Harris's hawk. This is their normal alarm call. So I wanted to determine then, of all the groups of Harris's hawks I knew, how many were breeding. It's breeding that's important. So I looked at nests, and I knew where quite a few areas were, where there were pairs that were there all the time, so there must be a nest. And they don't hide their nests, so it was pretty easy to find quite a few nesting areas. And down below, there's 3 birds that were caught from one group at the same time. And so when I found the nests, I watched for the chicks, and once the chicks fledged, they become fledglings, they continued to food beg. And they're doing this a lot. And so it was very easy, once I get to the area, to find them because you could hear them. And so I glommed on to 1 or more chicks, and I just sat there and I watched. And what I wanted to find out is how many adults are around this bird. And so from that, I determined group size. So once they fledged and they started to food begging, I spent on several trips, sometimes 3 or 4, up to 5 hours looking at them. And if in 5 hours I only saw a pair of adults, then it was pair. But usually, or more often, when I watched for 5 hours, there was a 3rd bird or a 4th bird, 3rd and a 4th bird. And so therefore I determined group size of them. So the results I got from, in 1 year, 77 territories, another year, 73 that I looked at, but I could only determine the group size in 39 and 34 because I was just one person doing this. It does take time. And from them, more than half of the groups, more than half of the territories had groups, 3 or 4 adults. So the bottom line is 56% in my study of the birds were cooperative breeding, and they weren't breeding as pairs. So therefore, the group size of Harris's hawks in South Texas is the same as it is in New Mexico and Arizona. And that is that they breed as pairs or they breed in a group. Now here's an interesting thing I found from 7 cases of birds, and that has to do with the molt. So the simple line is when they start molting in the primaries, that's where the hand is, there are 10 primary feathers there. It starts from the innermost and it goes to the outermost, one at a time, usually in a row. You can see from the left-hand slide that that bird has replaced 4, 5 feathers, and the other ones are still juvenile. But in the one on the right, it skipped over primary 4. And that just doesn't happen. I've looked at molt in many different species and nobody has reported this before. So I've got a paper in press for submitted to the Wilson Bulletin explaining these 7 cases. I've cooperated also with Dr. Bednarz from the University of North Texas. Jim did his PhD work in New Mexico on Harris's hawks. So he came down here, he wanted to see, after my paper on the group size, he wanted to see the territory down here. And the first thing, I took him out one day and I showed him over 100 territories of greyhawks. And it was a long day, but it was an interesting day. And so he had at most 26 cases, 26 territories in New Mexico. The second thing that amazed him was that the birds didn't fly away when we stopped and looked at them, that they were tamed and that we could actually look at them from the car. And so he decided to set up a study. So he got a graduate student, Andrea Gibbons, and they wanted to look at the relationship among the helpers. And so who are the nest helpers? Are they related? Or is there any polygamy going on? And Andrea did a wonderful job, but she also took blood samples for DNA because she wanted to look at relatedness from the chicks and from the adults and what have you, and found some interesting things. So this study was also in the 3 counties down here, Cameron, Hidalgo, Willacy. The original intent of the study was to work in wildlife refuges, but there just weren't enough nests in the wildlife refuges. And I knew about many more nests, a lot of them urban, right in towns and what have you, but some in natural areas too. So part of the study was to color band the birds, putting the color band on one leg for males and on the other leg for females. And Jim had a bunch of bands of lots of different colors. And of course, each band, the color band has a code on it, usually two different things, alphanumeric, one over the other. And we had 5 or 6 different colors. So we got a lot of color banded birds out there. I think there's still probably a couple hundred Harris's hawks running around with color bands on. I still get a photograph or a report every now and then. So adults and juveniles, but also chicks in the nest. Andrea did a lot of nestling banding. And what she found, as far as the helpers were, as that a lot of the chicks from that nest stayed with the adults. So after 3 months, over half of the chicks were still in the territory. Now, most raptors this size, the juveniles disperse after 1 month. So this is very unique. So this is something very different. But even after 9 months, there was still a quarter of the birds there. And some of them even stayed for a year. A few of them did. But she also found from the DNA that there was there's some polygamy going on, polyandry. Both actually polyandry with excess male, extra male, and polygyny with extra females. And so here was a case from one nest, and there were 2 chicks in the nest that were too different in age for them to come from the same mother. Because when a female raptor lays an egg, the first egg, usually they wait 2 days, lay the second egg, and then begin incubating. And then every other day, they can lay an egg. So if there are 4 eggs laid, the difference in the first 2 and the second one is 4 days. And we didn't have anything more than 4. And so these 2 chicks here are about a week and a half different in age. So they didn't come from the same mother. And so we had 2 females laying eggs in this one. And this particular territory is very interesting and probably deserves a study in itself, because there was an adjacent territory that she found where sometimes that is another group there, and sometimes both groups got together. And sometimes she saw as many as 9 adult Harris's hawks in the same place together. So anyhow, so they do have polygyny. Now, Patty Rainey, who is a bird photographer here, she's a dental technician, for her profession, but she does a lot of excellent photography. So she was watching a trio of Harris's hawks out west of here, and she watched the male copulate with one female, and then when he finished, he flew over to the other female, and he copulated with her. And so this is a case of polygyny, where one male is copulating with two females. And so they probably have one nest. They probably put their eggs in together, but she didn't have the nest at that territory. With Andrea, she and Jim were approached by a undergraduate, a senior at Cornell University, who wanted to put nest cams on some of the nests to look at the food that the prey that they were getting. And so you can see that there's a nest cam above this nest. Why aren't you? Uh-oh. Let's see if I can do it this way. Okay, there we go. And so here is one of the nest cams results. So the nest cam is up above it. Now the female at one point will look up at the nest, at the cam. And when they first do it, they're very suspicious. Now, she's feeding the chicks, and of course, what Sam wanted to do, Sam Hagler is the Cornell student. Yeah, you see her looking out, but then she said, okay, it hasn't moved, and I'll get back to feeding. And what she found was very interesting, and she included all of us as co-authors on the paper, which is now published in the Journal of Raptor Research. But she found that the urban birds had just as many prey deliveries as the suburban birds, even though the urban birds were more likely to be a pair than the natural birds. But the problem was that she was only looking at it in the summer. And so we think the nest helpers are more needed if the nests are in the winter, because they breed all 12 months a year. So in the winter, there's probably less prey, but they're still trying to breed, and so that's when the nest helpers are probably more helpful. Here's some oddities. This is an adult female Harris's hawk that lost an eye. And was she aggressive? I mean, I put the trap out and didn't even have time to turn around, and she was down and caught. Now here is the bottom bird, has a very pale eye. So there's a lack of pigmentation there. You can see the upper bird is a normal color. And here is a bird with a cataract. So this one is probably also more aggressive, because just like the missing eye, it's not being able to see much out of that eye, so everything is blurry. So out of all of the bands that we put on, we only had 21 band recoveries, and they were all in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and most were found dead, but one was shot. So we do still have a problem with somebody out there shooting what they shouldn't shoot. I get regularly photos of color-banded Harris's hawks. Someone eventually points them to me, because I've got the compilation of all of the color bands, all those 200 and some color bands, by color, by code. And this bird was particularly interesting, because this is on the entrance to Laguna Atascosa Wildlife Refuge. We caught the pair there together early on, and the female only had one leg. So I have two bands to put on, usually put them on each leg, but I didn't have a choice. I had to put both bands on both legs. Now, other people have done studies with raptors, and they have put two bands on one leg and two bands on the other leg, if they do a bunch of different color schemes. So anyhow, this was more than a year later, maybe 2 years later, after she was banded. Okay, so I found some oddities, birds. This was a Quercus caracara, and it had a long bill syndrome, where the lower mandible just kept growing out. So it's crossed over the other. And here is a whitetail hawk, juvenile, that I've caught. Same thing, the lower mandible keeps growing out. And here are some Harris's hawks. the upper mandible has grown really long, and the lower mandible has stopped growing. Oops. Okay, and here's where the lower mandible, instead of growing straight out, it just, thank you, thank you. Instead of growing out, instead of stopping growing and growing around it, it grew down. And so this is called avian keratin disorder. It's been shown in several raptors, especially red-tailed hawks, but it's also being studied by a group of scientists in Alaska on black-eyed chickadees and other species. White-tailed kites, we've banded 28, especially in the last couple of years. Mike got pretty good at catching them. And normally, white-tailed kites have a very pretty call. So this is when they're talking to each other, particularly around the nest. But when you have them in the hand, they do this. And they have bad breath. So Mike caught 2 juveniles winter before last that were still in juvenile plumage. Now, white-tailed kites nest usually in the spring and early summer. And within 2 months after fledging, they lose this plumage, this gray-brown plumage, and they get an almost adult-like plumage, gray plumage. And so he's caught these birds in January and February. And so therefore, they have to be nesting. They had to be out of the nest less than 2 months. And so it was very interesting. So we wrote a paper for the Bulletin of the Texas Ornithological Society documenting that. Now, there was a previous paper in the same bulletin because Mike Marsden and Mike Miller found a white-tailed kite nest on 3 January 2015. And I took this picture maybe 2 days later of the juveniles in the tree. So it shows that they can winter breed. And that particular winter had a lot of rain, so there was a lot of prey. Now they prey mostly on microtein rodents, particularly probably cotton rats and something like that. And so that was also published in the Bulletin of the Texas Ornithological Society. Now I've worked quite a bit with white-tailed hawks. They were mostly caught in sugarcane fields. And sugarcane fields are burned before they're harvested in almost all cases. And so when they're burned, they actually burn up some animals that are there that don't get into the ground soon enough. And we call these toasties. And then when they're harvesting, they've got big tractors and great big things. They run over other animals. And we call these mashies. And so the fields, once they finish it, and there's nothing in the field, all the sugarcane is gone and the harvesting tractors and everything are gone, there's still a lot of toasties and mashies, and there are some live animals in there too that have gone underground. They come up, but there's no cover. So the first thing that happens is the scavengers come in, turkey vultures primarily, caracaras, and some black vultures. But the white-tailed hawks come in to steal prey from scavengers. And so there's a lot of white-tailed hawks there. And so we've captured 939. Probably the vast majority of them are in sugarcane fields, although the last few years, there haven't been as many in the fields. So in a field like this, what we'll do is we'll just go along those rows and put a trap out. And right next to it, put a little marker flag with an orange thing you see that they use for finding pipes and things underneath the ground. And so we mark them so we can check them. And we just leave them there. And after a while, the hawks come in and hopefully get caught trying to get the mice or the sparrow or whatever else it is. And sometimes we also get multiple captures and 2 or 3 on a trap at the same time. And again, have one time with whitetail hawks got 4 on the same trap. And there was a juvenile red tail that was trying to find the mice around these 4 that didn't get caught. But every time he came down, the whitetails would do this and he would go up. So he never had a chance.
That was some frantic mice.
Yeah, it's part of their life experience. So whitetail hawks are different from red-tailed hawks or red-shouldered hawks or broadwing hawks, which only have a juvenile and an adult plumage. They have a delayed maturation. So they start off as juveniles in the lower right, and then they go into the second plumage, upper right, and the third plumage, upper left, and then finally adult, lower left. And so they have 4 age-related plumages, which is very interesting. And here you see them from the back. And we have illustrated this in the Hawk's Guide that I co-authored. And what I found also is there's some variation by sex, not absolute, but more likely. So females tend to be darker, males tend to be younger in juveniles. So these are the first plumage birds. And so here we have 2 different sets of male and a female together. Female is the darker one, male is the lighter one. And in the second plumage birds, the males tend to be more rufusy and the females tend to be dark brown. And in the adults, the male head color is more pearly gray, pale gray, and the females are more medium gray. And of course, there are size differences too. So I've written 2 publications. One of them submitted was looking at known sex birds because my colleagues, from my feather samples that I took, determined the sex from the DNA. So then we have measurements of each bird and we have sex. And from that, we can use a formula called discriminative function analysis, taking some of the measurements in, plugging it in, and based on the known age birds, sample of more than 100, we can determine what the sex is by putting this formula in. If it's less than a certain number, it's a male. If it's greater than, it's a female. And then I have another paper that I'm just ready to submit, looking at the molt differences between each of the age classes. And, but interestingly enough, once these raptors get caught with the Bouchette tree trap, they don't come back to it. They learn. You fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, yeah. It doesn't happen, or it happens very infrequently. So I have very few recaptures. So most of the encounters with whitetail hawks have been dead birds, or birds. I've been able to determine a couple of birds by looking at a series of photographs of a bird that's real close that a photographer takes, where the band moves around a little bit because the number wraps all the way around. And so you just from one photograph, you only get part of the number. Okay, crested caracaras, interesting bird, full of personality. And when they make this noise, they throw that head back. Go back, what noise? That's Patty Rainey's photograph again. Excellent photograph. So there are 3 age-related plumages for the crested caracara, the adults and the juvenile, and then there's an intermediate, an annual plumage that's intermediate. And Brian Wheeler and I, when we were doing the Hawk's Guide, we were at a chicken farm up near Kingsville, and we had all these caracaras, maybe 40 or 50 of them around, and we were taking photographs of them. And we noticed that some of the adult birds were blackish and some were blackish brown. So I went to the American Museum of Natural History and I looked at specimens there. And what I found was that yes, there is an intermediate plumage, and determined the differences between them. So the adults are blackish, and of course the specimens don't have the color, the face color and the leg color like the adults do. So they're blackish and they're barred here, they're barred here. And the juveniles are brown, and they're streaked here and they're streaked there. and the colors on the face and the legs are very different. But the intermediate birds, the basic two, which is the terminology for that, are in between, but they're closer to the adults. So they look like adults, but they're browner, and the barring up here and the barring on the back is not clear, it's not clean, it's messy. And the top of the head has rufous streaks in it. The adult has a black crown, it has a dark brown crown with rufous streaks in it. So anyhow, I wrote that up. There's the basic two birds in the hand. Oh, by the way, the only place I've caught them, and these are really hard to catch. Mike has caught one just alongside the road, but I think he tried. But the only ones I've caught, because I don't try them, because they don't come in, have been in the sugarcane field. And the last three I caught were on colored doves, interestingly enough. And so I wrote this up for Birding Magazine some years ago. And the plumage terminology changed from then to now. Turkey vultures, interestingly enough, at sugarcane field, we've caught 3 turkey vultures. This is Gus Renfro. You may know him. He's a herpetologist. Loves snakes and all those things. Anyhow, Gus helps me occasionally. And but every time we caught a turkey vulture, it was Gus that got it off the trap. So we think he has a special affinity to these birds, which, by the way, are, I think, really lovely birds. I do a talk on turkey vultures for Frontera Audubon Society. If you want to hear that, maybe schedule me for that one. But we can't ban turkey vultures. Does anybody know why? They defecate on their legs, and because there's a band under there, the defecation can cover the legs up, and all of those nasty things that are in the carcass, on all those pathogens that are on dead things, can get under that and then cause an infection. And in fact, that's what happened. A turkey vulture that was banded on the leg was found with its leg all swollen up and sick and dying from that. But they can be marked with color markings on the wings. Aplomado falcons, very interesting bird, one of our specialties down here. They were reintroduced by the Peregrine Fund. I'll talk about that in a minute. But for many years, 6 years, I had a permit to ban them. The problem was I never found many to ban. Only banded 9 down there. And I said, this is kind of ridiculous to have this endangered species permit and jump through all these hoops, and I just don't see them. Oops. Okay. They were extirpated from this area, and there's some controversy on why they were extirpated. I think I know. There was a collector, a bird collector down here who collected eggs, he collected bird skins, named Frank Armstrong. And he had a business in Brownsville. And he had connections to people on both sides of the border, probably going 50, 100 miles away. And so they brought him the skins and what have you. What is going on? So this historic range came from that paper in the Journal of Raptor Research. But many specimens were sent out by Frank Armstrong to a dealer in New York. And at that time, bird skins were a commercial commodity. So he got $2 or $5 or something for each one, which was quite a bit of money back in the 1910s, 1920s. But I looked at the skins in the collection of Welder Wildlife Foundation up beyond, in Sinton, Texas, up beyond Corpus Christi. They had 65 sets of Aplomado falcon eggs. Each one had 5 eggs in it. Normally, Aplomados have 2 or 3 eggs. So obviously, there's a lot more than 65 egg clutches that were taken from the nest of Aplomado falcons in South Texas. And so that has got to have a striking effect on the population. Plus, I found Aplomado falcon skins all over the world, in China, in Japan, in South Africa, in the British Museum, in Kenya. So that's my thing is they got lost in that. So the Peregrine Fund began to raise them in captivity and started putting them out. The first nest of these was down near the port of Brownsville in an old raven's nest. And since that time, they've continued to put a lot of birds out. And but they also have nested in natural nests of other things, raven, white-tailed kite, etc. But then they've started putting out these breeding platforms. The first ones were just plywood. The second ones were more effective because they're like a pigeon carrier in that they have dowels there. And the birds can get in, the falcons can get in, but the ravens going after the eggs or the great horned owl going after the chicks can't get in. And so that's made their thing more popular. Now there have been anywhere from 14 to some odd nests. And talking to the guys that are doing the study from the Peregrine Fund, it's probably between 9 and 12 pairs are regular. And so they're hanging in there, but they're not increasing. So there may be just a habitat problem, that there's only so much habitat for them. But they're still here, and you can still find them on Route 100 and several other places, Old Port Isabel Road, and that's where I take people to find their first Apamado falcon. Red-shouldered hawks are interesting. When I came here, there probably were no red-shoulders nesting here in early 2000. We didn't know of any. Nobody knew of any. I never saw them or heard them. Once when I was in the American Museum of Natural History, which I used to spend a lot of time, I lived just outside of Washington, D.C., and I hit all the museums on the East Coast. I was a museum rat, I guess you could say. And I was in the area where those butios were, and there was a drawer, American Museum of Natural History, down at the bottom that was unlabeled. And I opened it up, and it had 44 adult red-shouldered hawk specimens. Every one of them said, Frank Armstrong, Brownsville, Texas. So I think he wiped out population along the Rio Grande just by himself. Now they're nesting. We started finding a few nests. I've seen probably maybe in the last 8 years, 3 or 4 nesting areas. I've heard about a couple of more. And so I think they are breeding here. Now, the subspecies that breeds here is Texanus. And it's different from the subspecies that is mostly in the east, which is the nominate, which is Buteo lineatus lineatus. And so there are subtle differences between the two. We get both species here, both subspecies, but most of them are Texanus. So those are the adults, and here are the juveniles, and there are subtle differences between the two. Several oddities. This one juvenile had pox, avian pox, which usually affects the eye or it affects the feet. And the other one had its beak broken off. Probably it was a longbill that I showed you before, and because that extra thing gets really weak there and it breaks off. Swainson's hawk. Swainson's hawks are here all year, and they have been since I was here, but we did not have Swainson's hawks breeding in Cameron County when I came here. The only Swainson's hawks I knew about in the early years, early 2000s, were over in Hidalgo County, right on the border, and maybe 1 or 2. But since that time, they've expanded their range, like a couple of other species. For instance, clay-colored thrush. For the first time this spring, I have a clay-colored thrush in my neighborhood that's calling, and it hasn't been there before, and I know the call. And so it's one of those nice things that populations can expand and what have you. Swainson's hawks is one of them. But we also have these tremendous migrations in the autumn and in the spring of Swainson's hawks, and we have wintering birds. And it's the wintering birds that I've gone after because they hook up with, they occur in the sugarcane field with the white-tailed hawks. And so oftentimes, putting the traps all around like that, we end up with the Swainson's hawk. Okay, I mentioned all that. So most of the Swainson's hawk migrate to Argentina. Now this is a map of many, many satellite transmitter Swainson's hawks, going all the way from the western U.S. all the way down into a certain area of Argentina, an area called the Chaco, where the vast majority are. And the reason for that was one guy who was studying Swainson's hawks in Washington put two satellite transmitters on his birds, and he got information back that they were in this area of Argentina. So on his own nickel, he took leave. He flew down to Buenos Aires, rented a car, went right to this area where they were, and he found a ranch, a big finca, where the entrance had lots of trees going back and forth. The Swainsons were spending the night in those trees. And then as he drove through there, he found dead Swainsons on the ground. So he alerted his colleagues in Argentina about this, and they came and they collected them, and they found that they were all poisoned with monoclotropros, which was put out by the farmers against grasshoppers, which were killing their grain. Well, of course, the name in Spanish for Swainson's hawks there is grasshopper eater, translated. And so they poisoned the grasshoppers, the Swainsons came in and ate them. And the sick ones, easier to catch, and then they died. So it was actually a very interesting thing that caused all of these people to put radio transmitters on to see where their birds, if they went to this area. But it was also a conservation success because the government, the company that made monocrotopos, and the agencies, and both in the United States and Argentina, they all banned it, and immediately it was taken off, and there was no more applied, and the problem went away. So I got a little bit of money from Swarovski to get a satellite transmitter, one, because obviously if the Swainson's hawk is here in the winter, it's not in Argentina. Where's it coming from? My guess is they were coming from the Arctic, from Alaska, where there is a very small population, or Yukon. And so I got this, we put it on this bird, this juvenile, on January 25th. And he went down into Mexico, and he went up to the King Ranch, and he went around and quite a few places. But unfortunately, on February the 7th, this is the last fix. Something happened to it. And he was right in the middle of a field, and I went out in the field, and I never found any feathers, never found the transmitter or anything. So that didn't work out. We don't know where they're coming from. And so this is the breeding atlas from the Texas Breeding Bird Atlas. And as you can see, there's some breeding down there, but not very many. And so we didn't have Swainson's hawks breeding in Cameron County, just in Hidalgo County. And so starting at Terry Fuller found a nest in Cameron County about 2013 or so, and took me and showed me that. And since that time, there's been more and more down here. So they're now breeding in Cameron County. And some of them are in urban areas. In particular, we found the birds over in McAllen in the urban area. We had Harris's hawks and Swainson's hawks breeding very close together, just around trees and businesses and houses and what have you. Out of all the Swainson's hawks we banded, we only had one recovery, and that was from Argentina, and it was in the province north of Buenos Aires, and you can see that's where that arrow is, out of 220 banded. And it was a juvenile, caught it in April, and the next time it went down, April 2005, actually, it went down twice. So it was a year and a half later that it was found as a basic two bird. And Cooper's hawks, again, the same thing. There weren't any Cooper's hawks nesting here that we knew about. Tim Brush had a graduate student studying ultimate royals in Benson Park, and some years ago, and when she was doing her Oriole study, she found a Cooper's nest. Tim took me in and showed me that. And although I had a Cooper's doing display flight, male Cooper's doing display flight as early as 2005, but never found the nest. Anyhow, they have expanded and they're breeding in greater numbers now. And in fact, they have become urban. It's one of the first raptors described as an urban raptor because of the population in Tucson, Arizona. So for the second year, we have birds, and the urban nest is here in Arlington. And I caught 2 of the 3 juveniles. So we only had 2 recoveries from close to 100. And that's about right for raptors, 1 or 2%. So you have to get big numbers there. One of them was in Ohio, Iowa. It's a little bit, almost straight north, but a little bit to the east. Red-tailed hawks, they've banded quite a few, 720 red-tailed hawks. Most of them are juveniles, but quite a few adults. Now, the 10 band recoveries are interesting. One of them was from Alberta, and I think a lot of the birds, I did some field work in Alberta, looking at Harlan's hawks and red-tailed hawks up there, and I caught some birds up there too. So I got an idea of what they look like there, and I think some of the birds that I'm catching now are from that area. But one was from Missouri and one was from Nebraska. So many races occur. Now, the northern red-tail is something that was a forgotten subspecies and recently revisited. And it turns out that they're much more like western red-tails than eastern red-tails. And so most of the records in Texas and farther east, they're thought to be western or really northern. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Eastern red-tail is the one that's widespread throughout the east. The Fuerte red-tail is the one that breeds in the drier parts of Texas, and very pale and unmarked, usually not much of a belly band. And then we get to Kreider's hawk, which is really not a subspecies, but it definitely is a color variant in a small area of the Dakotas. It was probably isolated during the glacial maximum to get very pale. So it has whitish on the head, whitish on the tail. And then we have the back of all 4 of those. What's going on? It's just be a little patient. So in the back of it, so you see the Kreiders down at the lower right has a lot of white in the tail. And then we have western red-tails. Now I've caught a few western red-tails here, and they differ a little bit from the northern red-tails. And it's too much detail to go into it. But they do occur, and there are some specimens here in southern Texas. But it's changing what we think about them, because really what we thought were western red-tails are really northern red-tails. And I wrote this article for the Bulletin of the TOS. And if you look at the map, those are birds from the west coast that are western red-tails. And those are birds that are being tracked by satellite transmitters, and they all go south. They don't come east. There's one record there in South Texas. And so all of these birds that occur on the Great Plains and occur on the east, to the east of that, including at Cape May, are northern red-tails. So, and they have a rufous morph and a dark morph. That was also in that article there, that I had quite a few dark morph specimens of northern red-tails that I could differentiate from western red-tails by a couple of characters. So this is a partial albino red-tailed hawk. It has a lot of white feathers, or should have normal colored feathers. And so the question that's asked often is, does that change with time? So I banded this in 2011, and in 2015, Eric Brunke, who is a bird photographer, took pictures of the same bird in the same place with bands on it. We don't show the bands here, but you can see that it's increased in the amount of white. And Harlan's hawk is one of the birds that I've studied. I think it's very different from red-tail. They evolved from red-tail, but the people who do the taxonomy I don't believe that. They think it's a red-tailed hawk, even though it's
Attention library patrons, the library will be closing in 30 minutes. Library cards will stop being issued and updated in 15 minutes. Computer use and Wi-Fi services will be turned off in 15 minutes. Please make plans to print or save your work. Thank you.
Okay. So anyhow, I think it's a separate species in particular that the adults are different. They're more dark, more the tail is always never completely red and what have you. But I've caught 7 juveniles down here. By the way, it's Jimmy Paws. I think he was signed up holding that Ireland's hawk here. And American kestrels. And I've gotten kind of interested in American kestrels because we thought that we could age them based on the width of the last tailbone. Thick for adults, narrow for juveniles. And that was based on these 2 publications. But what we found out is many kestrel banders think, well, some juveniles have wide bands. And so we looked at quite a few wide bands of them. And in fact, we looked at this publication put out by Hawkwatch International, where they showed a lot of juveniles. They're obviously chicks, and they have a wide, the glass band is wide. So we can't, if juveniles have narrow and wide, we can't distinguish them. Now we know that juveniles can show both. And so that makes it really hard to be able to age them. Adults always have the wide. But since juveniles have the wide too, if they have wide, we don't know. If they have narrow, we can say they're probably juveniles. But there is a publication by a chap named Peter Pyle, and he shows differences in the tail tip shape, where the juveniles are more pointed and the adults are more blunt. So A and B are juveniles, more pointed, the adults are blunt. So a group of us looked at that with known age birds. So we have birds that we know how old they are. They can be caught once, catch them a year later, have to be an adult. And so we found that known age adults, they always have the wide band on there. Okay, known age juveniles can have wide or narrow, but of the adults, their tail tip looking at 8 feathers, and they're more blunt and more straight across, and the juveniles are more pointed. So anyhow, this is the sample size. It's actually quite a bit, 169 females. Does it work for males? Mostly it works for males, not as good as females, 79. And so with one possible exception, and we're not quite sure about that bird. It was a bird that was captured later, and we don't know whether the tail got worn or what have you. Now, when the tail is wet or really worn, we can't tell. So I then captured 69 kestrels last winter, and I found that it worked in most cases. The unknowns, there are 6 females and 4 males, were birds that the tail was wet. And I couldn't tell the shape of it. So we published this. Those are the other co-authors in North American Bird Bander. And I've heard a couple of feedbacks from people who have banded them say, yeah, it works, but sometimes we can't do it. Now, here's something interesting. I got a automatic bow net for kestrels, and there's a little cage in there that rotates up, and there's a hook that comes over and hooks on it. And we put a mouse in there. And when the kestrel comes down and he hits that, it moves that, and the trigger goes out of the way, and the net goes over, such that when we finish it, we have a kestrel underneath the bow. And there's webbing underneath it too, so it can't get out. And one time when we were out, and Chuck was there, Chuck pulled up his cell phone, and he says, I'm going to video this. Okay, let's see what he did. So there's the kestrel up there. Remember, it's just a cell phone. So you see the kestrel up there at the top. There he's coming down. So he lands next to the trap. And then when he jumps on it, hits it, it goes over, it catches him. and then we come up and grab him for banding. So I've captured an adult female that Mark Conway banded 8 years previously in exactly the same spot. That was interesting. And I've had 5 recaptures of birds that I banded more than a year later in the same location too. So once they get to the winter area, they stay in a really small spot. And I've captured 2 already banded ones, both of them banded at a raptor banding station, one of them in Duluth, Minnesota, and the other in Ontario, along Lake Ontario, which kind of moved pretty far to the west. And this is a certificate that the bird banding lab sends out when you turn in a band. And this is the Mark Causey bird. Now the last bird I want to talk about is grayhawk. And I want to talk about Mike Stewart. He's beginning now a 5-year study, starting this last fall, on grayhawks in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Now he's at Texas A&M Kingsville. For the last 2 years, he was at UTRGV in Edinburgh and also studying grayhawks. So he finished his MS, and now he was my sub-permittee during that period of time. Now his study is focused on their habitat selection and population dynamics, which is a little bit deep. But the main thing is we're color banding, and we're banding them. So Mike has found many new grayhawk territories, and we've banded 148 chicks, juveniles, and adults. And the vast majority of those have color bands on them. And we're getting photographs and reports of the birds. So all of them captured now have the USGS band on one leg and a color band on the other leg, orange for the females and black for the males, regardless of age. And Mike has put some GSM transmitters. Now these are GPS transmitters. They go to satellites, get the GPS, and then periodically, 1 day, half a day, 3 days, they find a cell tower and they send the information on where they were. And so he's gotten wonderful data on that. Once we were out trying to catch some juveniles for banding, and Billy Snyder pulled up his cell phone and he recorded the bird. So this is the food begging call of the juvenile. And I'm going to try it in another month or so because the juveniles are just now starting to fledge. We'll give them a couple of weeks to start learning how to hunt. Then I'm going to go out and I'm going to play this call and see if I can get them to come in. And then they're going to look down and they're going to see a nice juicy mouse there. And we're going to be able to catch them, I hope. We were able to catch them the last 2 summers too without doing this, but I think it might help to have that. Now Mike has also captured adults that won't come to the traps with a mechanical owl, a stuffed owl that the head rotates and the wing moves a little bit. And then he puts his short mist nets around them. And we've had some luck. He's had some luck catching them that way. So again, I talked about the GSM transmitters. And so he's also put VHF transmitters. Now these are transmitters where you have to have a receiver with an antenna. And there you have to be on the ground. So the other one transmits to the company, and then they send him the data every time it transmits. Now here's some photos of color banding grayhawks, Tim Brush, Mike. This was a juvenile, and this one was interesting. This was a bird that was over there just beyond on the Sherwood Park Road, just beyond the convention center. That was really nice to show people. And this was a raptor photographer that I took around, and you got pictures of it. But unfortunately, it died. And the transmitter just, had one fix in the middle of a field with plowed, no transmitter, no feathers, nothing. And then finally, here's another one up there. So when Mike started, we knew of 6 nests in parks, including the one at Ansel Duas, which is the first one that was there when I first came, and 5 in towns. First one we found in towns was 2016 that Donna McCown found it down here on Altus Palmas Drive in 2016. And since that time, we know of 73 territories, 38 urban, 32 natural, and 3 others that are hard to categorize as being natural or urban. And we also know of lots of other places where birds have been seen, but we haven't seen a pair, or they don't have a territory. This is a bird that I banded in 2014, and it turned out that it had a mate, and it was one of the breeding birds in Mercedes. So Mike put the owl up and caught this bird, and then he put a VHF transmitter on it. And he did that in 2020, so it was 6 years after I caught it. I caught it as a 3rd-year bird, so it was 2 years old then, and so he caught it. And just the other day, I took another fix of it. I could hear it there in the nest area, and so it's at least 10 years old. There's no longevity record for the bird banding lab, so I just submitted that as the longevity record for Greyhawk. So after several years, Michael will be able to learn more about the breeding and winter ecology, summer ecology of Greyhawks in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. And his master's work has been submitted to the Journal of Reptile Research, and they've come back with reviews, and we're in the process of going over those reviews and making a few changes. And usually Greyhawks have 2 or 3 chicks in each nest. But a few years ago in Benson Park, there were some people watching. They had a nest with 5 chicks, and that's a picture of them there. You can see them each by a number there in red. There are 5 chicks there. And so we ended up, I ended up writing this up, including myself as a co-author, for the people who had been seeing it, and it was published in the Bulletin of the TOS. So, and finally, let me give thanks to Chuck Cornell and Billy Schneider, the 2 helpers who are helping me most lately, and some who have helped me in the past, Gus Renfro, Mark Conway, and Kelly Smith. And I thank you for your attention. Any questions?
You talked about Frank Armstrong and he would sell bird skins. What were they used for?
Museums.
Just museums?
Museums, oh yeah. It was, yeah, the museums spent a lot of money on getting bird skins at that time in the 1920s, 1930s. Oh yeah, yeah, it was a big business.
Just for their collection drawer?
Yeah, just for collection drawers. Yeah. Okay. Anybody else? Did any of the virtual people have questions in the chat room or whatever? Huh? Not at this time. Yes, ma'am.
Bill, I have a question. I have a question.
Go.
Do the Harris's hawks reuse the same nest? Because you know that nest that's on that was on those old salt cedar trees on Lovett Road and Hain Drive in San Benito. The pair is still there. And yesterday I was talking to my neighbor and she said she saw one of the hawks go into that existing nest.
Yes, they will. They will use the nest, but they'll also build new ones because sometimes they get blown down. We get some winds here sometimes, and the nest gets blown down.
Okay. Well,
okay,
that's an FYI. You might go check it out again. Remember, it's the one that the trees froze, so you can the nest is very visible now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How much does a transfer cost?
Well, it depends. So the ones with the like this, $200. The ones that go to the cell towers, $2,000. Plus, you have to pay for the data, which is hundreds of dollars a year for the data download. So it's not cheap. So you need to have benefactors. Yeah, I should think I should talk to Mike and see if he does a GoFundMe page and see if we can go around and get people to fund that. Okay, well, thanks.